Hello wonderful person, this is Anton, and today we're going to be discussing a completely new discovery of what seems to be a brand new weather phenomenon. Okay, it was always there, but the scientists didn't really know it existed. It's the phenomenon that's sort of visible right here, and the scientists are currently referring to it as atmospheric lakes. A type of a slow-moving storm phenomenon that seems to cause rain in certain regions of the planet and only seems to be present in certain locations very close to the equator. But let's discuss exactly what this means, and also let's talk a little bit more about similar phenomena that we already are familiar with. And here I wanted to start with a very famous weather phenomenon, very similar phenomenon, known as atmospheric rivers. A phenomenon responsible for rain and even storms in many regions of the planet, with the most famous example in the US usually referred to as Pineapple Express, which also happens to be a somewhat cheesy comedy, but that's not really where the name is from. The name refers to the origins of the precipitation caused by these atmospheric rivers, which usually hits west coast of the US, with the origin being Hawaii or Hawaiian Islands, which is why it's called Pineapple Express. And this is a really important weather phenomenon, specifically for places like California, where it's actually responsible for approximately half of all of the precipitation. Pretty much most of the rain here comes from these unusual formations. And in this video from NASA you can even see how all this is being delivered. And so here the atmospheric river refers to this very narrow corridor that's basically just moist air filled with a lot of water. And as this water then hits the ground, specifically as it starts hitting some of the higher areas like mountain regions, all of this then results in huge amounts of precipitation and obviously a lot of rain. And once in a while it brings so much precipitation that it ends up causing floods in various regions, like this right here in 2006 somewhere in the Washington state. But these rivers don't exist everywhere. They actually exist in only certain locations across the planet and are generally associated with what's known as the extratropical cyclones or extratropical storms. And because they can be several thousand kilometers in length and carry more water inside of them than the entire Amazon River, they do actually play a huge role in distributing water across the planet. As a matter of fact, it's estimated that approximately 90% of all of the water transport is actually done by these unusual river or cloud-like formations. Although none of this is new, all of this has been studied for many decades now. But now we come to a completely new phenomenon that was recently identified in a very specific location very close to the equator, with this image right here sort of showing us where all of this is. So here we have the Horn of Africa, this right here is India, and this is Sri Lanka. And it's this part that we're looking at. The scientists are currently not sure what to call this, but at the moment they're calling this an atmospheric lake. And at the moment this is also the only location where such an unusual phenomenon has been found so far. And according to the scientists behind the study that you can find in the description, this seems to be a completely unique and previously unknown weather phenomenon that always seems to happen in the Indian Ocean and always moves toward the eastern part of Africa. But unlike all of the other storms that we're kind of familiar with, it's not really created in the same way, and it also doesn't really circulate or doesn't form a cyclone. And so unlike other storms such as cyclones, or in this case hurricanes, it doesn't really move that fast and it doesn't circulate in the same way. As a matter of fact, the recent discovery shows that it barely moves at all, with the wind speed being less than 1 meter per second, or as the scientists suggest, close to zero. In other words, all of this sort of stays in a relatively similar area but does move toward Africa, although at an extremely slow pace. And unlike other storms, this is also produced in a slightly different way as well. Here the scientists suggest that this is produced by a concentration of water vapor that's dense enough to then start producing rain. Although in some sense it is kind of similar to how atmospheric rivers are produced as well. And according to the scientists, the actual properties of atmospheric lakes are extremely similar to these atmospheric rivers. The only difference is that, well, the rivers here are generally more or less continuous, so you can actually see that the river typically has a start and an end. And they also move much faster, delivering all of this moisture pretty quickly. This atmospheric lake, on the other hand, does not seem to have any origin. It sort of just forms in that particular area completely by itself. And then they basically become disconnected from everything else and just drift around until they hit land and then produce a lot of rain. With this paper then suggesting that a lot of dry regions in East Africa very likely being completely dependent on this phenomenon for delivering any rain at all. In other words, it seems to be the major source of water for a lot of regions on the east coast of Africa. And their existence directly depends on the fact that these regions have extremely low wind. And that's actually because it's very close to the equator, where the wind speed is generally pretty slow. For example, if we'll use this map that you can find in the description to look at the wind speed here, this whole patch where this lake was discovered basically has almost no wind at all. There are some really strong winds a little bit south of it, and also pretty strong winds in the north, but this region is wind-free. And because of this, these storms tend to survive an extremely long time. The longest one so far has been able to stay in this region for about 27 days. And in the last 5 years, the scientists identified at least 17 of these unusual formations. All of them were pretty close to the equator in this region east of Africa. But although this is so far the only region where the scientists were able to definitively find them, they don't actually believe that this is the only region where these storms exist. It's just in most other regions, usually this ends up being some sort of a tropical storm because of the other activity in the region. Here, however, for some reason, instead of becoming a typical tropical storm, the actual formation detaches itself from the other atmospheric rivers and ends up being its own atmospheric lake. Since this is a completely new phenomenon nobody's ever seen before, at this point nobody really knows what's going on here, how these formations move around, what drives them, what creates them, and more specifically, how these formations are going to be changing as the climate of the planet changes as well. And that's because the scientists have also identified that the changes in temperature, specifically water temperature, seem to actually affect how these storms and how these atmospheric lakes form and move around in this region. And so if the water temperature conditions in this area change and it changes the atmospheric lakes, it will then also affect the precipitation in a lot of the regions in Africa that might depend on this rain in one way or another. Which to some extent also connects to that video I made previously about the El Niño and La Niña phenomenon that you might want to check out there if you enjoy learning about atmospheric phenomena on planet Earth. But I guess one of the questions here is, why is it that this is the first time anyone's ever noticed these and the first time anyone's actually been able to study them? Well, here one of the main reasons is because of the timelines involved. Because these are extremely slow-moving and slow-forming phenomena, and also because these regions are generally pretty dry to begin with, nobody expected to find a storm-like phenomenon in this region of Earth. Nevertheless, this particular storm, despite being slow-moving and slow-forming, still seems to have quite an impact on this region. But it'll probably take a few more months or possibly even a few more years for the scientists to really learn to understand the true effects of these unusual storm phenomena and how they might affect other things in this region as well. And so for now, that's pretty much all I wanted to mention. But you might want to check out some of the previous videos, including the video where one of the teams suggested that there are actually other atmospheric rivers produced by forests. Video should be somewhere right there. Or this other video where the scientists have also identified another very interesting phenomenon in this region, referred to as Milky Sea. That video should be popping up somewhere right there as well. On that note, thank you for watching, subscribe if you still haven't, share this with someone who loves learning about space and sciences, and maybe come back tomorrow to learn something else. Maybe support this channel on Patreon by joining a channel membership or by buying the Wonderful Person t-shirt you can find in the description. Stay wonderful, I'll see you tomorrow, and as always, bye bye.